Hey everyone. So the last video I published was my video on the transcendent function, Jung's idea of how sort of the conscious mind and the unconscious mind can unify to create a sort of transcendence, which allows the ego to transcend the barriers that it kind of sets up for itself. I just realized I'm wearing my headphones. Um, but in this video, I want to just discuss that in a bit more detail because I know that some of you learn in different ways and prefer these sorts of longer videos. And that way I can give more details and more examples of what I'm actually talking about with respect to the transcendent function, because it might not be totally clear from that last video what exactly I meant. And I really want to emphasize how this function, how this transcendent function, it can be used as an instrument to greatly improve your life in a variety of ways. It allows you to be more creative. It allows you to sort of explore the contents of your unconscious mind and familiarize yourself with what's going on inside of your mind that you're otherwise not conscious of. So it kind of allows you to sort of refresh your personality and sort of get a deeper understanding of who you are. It's also sort of how we take a brand new perspective on the world, and as well as sort of become more open-minded and more open to other possibilities than what the ego normally considers. And I also wanted to discuss how the transcendent function can be deliberately induced, how you can sort of deliberately induce states of mind in which you can experience the unconscious directly, and thereby experience the transcendent function. Because normally the unconscious is it's kind of like the conscious mind and the unconscious mind take turns. It's like one is active at night, the other is active during the day, or the unconscious sort of it does sort of bubble up and give contents to the conscious mind during the day, but it's kind of subtle, and you really have to pick up on it. But of course, this sort of process and the sort of state of mind in which you're experiencing your unconscious mind can be deliberately induced in order to sort of reap these benefits. And of course, there are many ways in which this is done, but the one I want to focus on, one which may be somewhat rather controversial, is the use of psychedelic drugs, because there's sort of been a renewed interest in this method of exploring the unconscious. So we'll get into that later in the video. Now, it'll probably make sense to start by discussing the nature of consciousness, of the conscious mind, and of the conscious ego. Now, like I said before, and like I said in my previous video, I have a video called like the psychology of the ego, and that one's really good if you really want to understand what the ego is and what consciousness is. But you may have noticed that like if you try to convince somebody to take a different perspective, something which they weren't taught as they were growing up, it can be rather difficult. And the reason this is because the ego, which is your sort of identity of your idea of itself, also includes sort of your ideas about the world and how you perceive the world, and sort of perceive the things around you. And so if you have a certain specific way of seeing the world, the ego tends to crystallize around those conceptions, and it's relatively stable in that it doesn't want to be shaken. And so if you try to change somebody's perspective, it can be rather difficult because the ego naturally resists this. I mean, there's a good reason for this. The ego is not just being deliberately closed-minded. It's because of the fact that at a certain point of your life, you have to stop taking in new information and be able to use the information you have to sort of, productively live. As you're growing up as a kid, you're sort of experiencing the world new, but when you're an adult, your brain kind of just makes the assumption that you know everything that you need to know, so now it's time to get on with your life. So that, this has a purpose. So the ego has a general distaste for any new information which challenges its preconceptions. And this includes the ego's conception of itself, so who you think you are. It's very difficult to shape that image which you hold of yourself, even though there's no necessary correlation between the ego that you think you possess and what your psychology and what your mind actually is. Other people probably see you in a different light than you see yourself, but of course it's very hard to sort of pick up on that. You may imagine yourself as being a very competent individual, or on the other side of the spectrum, you may imagine yourself as being incompetent, when really the reality might be a bit more different or a bit more complicated. You may think that everyone likes you, or you may think that everyone doesn't like you. The point being is that if your conscious mind crystallizes around certain conceptions of yourself and of the world that outside of yourself, it's very difficult to sort of break that conditioning and allow sort of the ego to evolve. One of the things I compare the ego to is like a method actor who's really deep into the character that they're playing. So much so that they kind of, while they're playing the character, forget that they're playing a character and sort of embody this different person. Well, in a very real sense, you are also playing a character. Like right now, you're the character. You're the main character in the plot of your life, and your brain kind of treats the ego like it's a protagonist in your life story. But again, this character isn't necessarily real. It's just who you think you are. It's just kind of how your mind perceives yourself, and the reality is probably much deeper. There's probably significant parts to your personality which are either deliberately repressed or just you simply don't see them. There's also the fact that the ego is very heavily influenced by culture and by society, and sort of the system of education you grow up in, and sort of what your parents impose upon you and what your society imposes upon you. Those ideas sort of become the basis of your ego conceptions. And so there's a tendency for your ego to sort of have the character of your culture. We're influenced by other people to such an enormous degree, and so sort of the words you use and the way you talk is greatly sort of influenced by other people around you. But of course, because these sort of things are imposed upon you by an external source, there's no necessary connection between these sort of how society views the world and how the world is actually constituted. It's very possible that society wants you to see the world in a particular way, but that way either doesn't conform to who your psychology or what your psychology actually is, or to what the nature of the world actually is. So, your society might tell you certain things are good, like certain behaviors are good, while others are bad. But of course, that's not necessarily true. It's just sort of what society imposes upon you and sort of reinforces. And so your ego again sort of becomes locked into this very narrow societal range of conceptions. Now, this is all the nature of the conscious mind. It's very, again, the word I use is self-referential, because the ego is very good at representing things which it has experienced previously, but it's very bad at sort of taking in new information and sort of reshaping its preconceptions so that they sort of fit new data, so to speak. Now, all of this is in contrast to the unconscious mind, which it's very interesting that the conscious mind and the unconscious mind form this polarity, because the unconscious mind is usually very different from the conscious mind. It has a very different personality. It's actually much more open-minded. It seems to be okay with a degree of ambiguity, and it isn't merely re-representative, in the sense that it doesn't merely sort of just base what it knows off what it previously learned before. It's sort of willing to kind of mesh ideas and experiment with new thoughts, which aren't just things which your society's taught you. So whenever we want to take a new standpoint, which our society or our culture doesn't want to accommodate or is unwilling to accommodate, it is the unconscious mind which makes this possible. The unconscious mind, as opposed to the sort of rigid ego, again, is much more open-minded. And this sort of stems from the fantasy creating capacity of the unconscious mind. Again, one of the main primary ways in which we experience the unconscious is through our dreams. And you may have noticed that your dreams are kind of chaotic and random, and it's very hard to tell what's going on. And it's kind of, there's no sort of logic to the events that happen in a dream. One thing just jumps to the next. But it's that kind of chaotic state of mind which is the fertile ground for new ideas. You kind of have to induce a certain state of chaos in your mind in order to be able to sort of allow your mind to go beyond the bounds of what the ego has set. And so again, another contrast between consciousness and the unconscious is that consciousness is this very linear, rather structured way of thinking, usually through language. But the unconscious mind is kind of chaotic and all over the place. So it's, these are two very different types of thinking, but they both have a place. And it's really interesting because, we would, you probably have met somebody who you may consider to be closed-minded, but really nobody's closed-minded. It's just that people use their consciousness and unconscious minds to different degrees. And if let's just say, for example, you could go through somebody's unconscious mind when trying to convince them of something, you have a much more likely chance of succeeding, because the unconscious mind is okay with ambiguity. It's okay with things it hasn't experienced. In fact, that's kind of what it does. It's very good for taking in new information, which isn't merely just a re-representation of old information and of old ideas which have been crystallized by the ego. Now, the sort of ways in which the unconscious makes its presence known to us, they can be kind of hard to describe in some cases. Dreams are straightforward. You know what a dream is. And But there are also more subtle sort of appearances of the unconscious. And it's hard to describe. They feel like intuitions. They feel like feelings, like you just get it. Like if you're trying to understand something difficult, it's kind of like a eureka moment. You just kind of feel like you know what's going on. It's not as if you're telling yourself with the words in your mind that you understand something. It's more like a feeling. And the unconscious mind is very closely associated with emotions and how we feel rather than how we logically think with our inner monologue. And so feelings are very closely connected with the unconscious. And again, one of the ways in which the unconscious makes its presence known is through these feelings. And there are a lot of examples of this. I like to bring up empathy a lot. So empathy is, the ability to sort of place your mind in the perspective of somebody else. Something we don't normally do and something which the conscious ego naturally resists. Because again, the conscious ego bases its knowledge on what you experienced in the past. And so it kind of disregards other people's experiences, or worse, it assumes kind of that other people had the same experience as you, even though that can't be true because other people with different lives have had different experiences and so have a tendency to view the world in a different way. But again, the conscious mind isn't necessarily open to that possibility, but the unconscious mind is very closely connected with empathy. Our feeling of empathy, like we can understand the perspective of somebody else as if walking in their shoes, is something which stems from the unconscious mind. And again, it's like it has to do with that fact that we take a different perspective than the one we're normally used to, which is the sort of characteristic of the unconscious mind. So whenever you have this a deep realization, you finally understand something, which is either difficult to understand or which your conscious ego naturally resists, you can it feels like you get it, and that feeling is the unconscious sort of allowing you to experience something new and take in new information. And the fact that other people have their own unique experiences arises when we sort of allow the boundaries of our own ego to dissolve, which is something which is normally hard for the ego to do because of its self-referential nature. So whenever we adopt a new perspective, which we didn't previously have, what's happening at the psychological level is that we're allowing our previous model, our previous conceptions, which our culture has given to us and which our ego has shaped and sort of crystallized, we're allowing them to sort of decrystallize and sort of being shaken up. And this allows us to take a new perspective, to consider the possibility that what we believed previously may have been either wrong or inadequate, inadequately depicted the truth or the reality. And again, or of course, again, like I said before, the ego doesn't like to admit to the fact that sort of what it believed in the past is wrong, and that the sort of new models it adopts, its sort of remodeling of the old ideas it has, are sort of better, potentially better. They're not necessarily better, but the assumption is that as you grow older, you sort of gain more information about the world, and so you can sort of understand the world better, ideally, although that's not necessarily always the case. And this is basically what the transcendent function is. It's the ability to go through the unconscious in order to gain something, and reshape our consciousness. That's why we say it's the union of unconscious and consciousness, because something in the unconscious sort of stirs our egos and reshapes them, so that we sort of become reborn with this new ego, which has a new perspective. And so that's why, we go through the unconscious, and out of the unconscious, our ego becomes reborn as this new entity, which is in some sense improved versus the sort of previous ego that you had. And you could probably think there's a good chance that as you're listening to this, things have come to your mind that you believed that you were when you were younger, but which through the unconscious and through this transcendent function have sort of evolved in your mind. Now we can go deeper when we characterize the unconscious mind. Because it's not merely just this chaotic fantasy, it's also like engaged in a synthetic process. And what I mean by that is that you can imagine yourself going about your life, and then you become conscious of different things and different ideas, and then they sink into the unconscious because you're no longer thinking of them. Your mind moves on. What happens in the unconscious is that these ideas, your mind almost like tries to find patterns and connections between them. It has like this connective ability. Consciousness is very characterized by distinctions, by separation. It allows us to put things into different categories and to sort of view different elements of our world as isolated from their sort of the world in which they exist. That's kind of what consciousness does. Consciousness is very closely associated with the left hemisphere of the brain, which is also very closely associated with our right hand, the hand which we primarily use to grab things. And you can kind of think of that as being characteristic of consciousness. Consciousness is a way of sort of grabbing things with your mind and sort of isolating them. For example, we just take these sticky notes, like isolating them from their environment. That's what your conscious mind does. But while consciousness has this divisive ability, it divides, things, elements of the world from the world. The unconscious mind has a connective ability. It tries to sort of see things within a broader context, and sees how elements of the world are actually connected rather than separate from each other. So again, like I said before, it has this connective property. And again, this is why our unconscious mind is needed to widen our perspective. And this connective ability, it can be easily demonstrated. Like, for example, if I mention a concept like the Earth. So, to the conscious mind, the Earth is just a singular object. It's just the Earth, right? But what you don't realize is that in the unconscious mind, there's this connective process going on, in which the idea of the Earth is also connected with many other ideas. For example, the Earth is a planet, sure. But it's also our home. It's also the only place most of us will ever see. It's also extremely old and has gone through various phases. And it's not a static object. It's it's a changing object. It goes through various phases, and it constantly reshaped. The continents constantly change, and sort of what happens underneath the Earth changes, and earthquakes and glaciers and volcanoes change the landscape. So again, all of these ideas are in the unconscious mind, but you can bring them up when I mention them. But again, when you think of consciously something like the Earth, it's just a very simple idea. But the unconscious mind takes it as a very complicated idea and sort of connects all of these different ideas which you associate with the concept of the Earth. But when I tell you about the Earth, or tell you to think about the Earth, the conscious mind sort of has one idea. The unconscious mind sort of has this more broad idea, and sort of a spider web of different related ideas when you think of the idea of the Earth. And you don't feel these ideas consciously unless you bring them up, of course, but they're there nevertheless. And this is sort of what I mean by the unconscious mind has this connecting function. Now, this is also very useful when the ego wants to expand its concept of itself. So there's one thing when you're sort of taking a new perspective of the world, but it's a whole other thing when you take a brand new perspective on yourself. So again, like there's probably a good portion of your psyche, of the way you think, of the words you speak, which you don't necessarily notice because the conscious ego has a tendency to sort of represent an idealized version of yourself. Or if you're neurotic, an unidealized version of yourself, where you're sort of self-deprecating all the time. But again, going through the unconscious, you can gain a wider perspective of who you actually are. Now, like I said in the video that I last made, the unconscious mind is also the realm of creativity, and you can probably see why. And artists, for example, are much more sort of in tune with their unconscious mind. Because again, the unconscious is able to overcome the boundaries which the ego places around itself. And again, creativity is the ability to think beyond what is sort of immediately present to you. That's what the ability to be creative actually is. If you're just kind of stuck with the world as it appears to be, you'll never be able to create and bring forth anything new. To be creative, to be inventive, requires a kind of unconscious mind that's willing to sort of connect ideas and again consider possibilities beyond the boundaries which the ego places around itself and which are sort of placed around you by culture. Overcoming these boundaries through the unconscious mind allows you to be creative. And not just being an artist and not just being a writer, but also being an inventor or being an innovative business person or, an entrepreneur. These things also require a certain creativity, which the conscious mind isn't great at supplying. So like something like a dream, it's a very fantastical thing. Dreams are not realistic at all. But it's this fantasy which is the realm of creativity, because the fantasy, again, is it shakes up the boundaries of what is already known to allow you to consider other possibilities. And now one realm in which the transcendent function is particularly relevant and might be kind of surprising is the realm of science. And we don't normally think of science as being a creative endeavor, but in many ways, the best scientists, the scientists that completely change the game and sort of change the paradigm shifting scientists who allow us to see the world in a completely new way, again, largely did so through the unconscious. I mentioned Albert Einstein many times on my channel because he's a really good example of one of these thinkers. And his theory of general relativity, if you don't know, it's a sort of theory of how gravity works. When he first proposed this, it was, at the time, it was considered by mainstream scientists to be completely crazy. Because there's no way that something like general relativity could be true. Because again, back then they had an idea of how gravity worked, and sort of the ego's inability to accept new information led to all these scientists disparaging him. In fact, there was some book written, like 100 scientists against Einstein. But again, it turns out in the end that Einstein was right, I have this quote by him in this book. If I could just pull it up. I don't know. Many of you are probably familiar with this book, The Master and His Emissary. Very good. Very awesome, and very sort of gives a lot. It gives sort of a lot of Jungian ideas, but from a different perspective, the perspective of the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere of the brain. And it's very deep and it's very cool. And I'm going through it and I'm analyzing it very deeply right now. But one page that really caught my mind was that he makes an argument in this chapter that thinking itself is largely mediated by the unconscious. And he says, indeed, many of these things can be achieved satisfactorily only if we do not become too explicitly aware of the process, which would otherwise have a limiting and inhibiting effect. Okay, so if you think about this, what he's saying essentially is that when we try to consciously and deliberately think, we actually kind of get stuck because, again, we're always just referring back to the past. So what we need to do if we want to be able to sort of think outside the box is relax. Stop trying to think so consciously and allow yourself to kind of be unconscious of the process. One funny example of this is the fact that when you're writing a test and you're trying to consciously recall something you previously studied, it can be rather difficult, and it's very hard to remember when you're just trying to use your conscious mind. But if you just sit back and relax for a second, the idea or whatever it was you were trying to remember will just probably come to you naturally. And so it's very, this is actually very useful knowledge if you're a student. It's very imperative that you kind of, while you're writing a test, yet you allow your unconscious mind, rather than trying to consciously think of everything, to sort of do half the work for you. But if I keep reading this book, the quote by Einstein that I was referring to before, the words or the language, as they are written or spoken. So again, words and language are sort of internal monologue, is the language of the unconscious mind of the conscious mind, as opposed to the unconscious mind, which speaks through images. But he says that these words do not seem to play any role in the mechanism of my thought. So again, something like general relativity comes about not because he's trying to consciously figure out how gravity works, but because he just kind of sits there and then it kind of comes to him. It's pretty weird, but it's true. And this is sort of how really big ideas and really important ideas, paradigm shifting discoveries in science are made. They aren't made by sort of trying to deliberately think. They happen sort of spontaneously. And there are many examples of this listed in this book. For example, I actually mentioned these examples before, funny enough. But for example, the benzene ring, which is like a chemical structure, it was a big mystery in science until the scientist who discovered it, Kakule, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, sort of had a dream of an image of, funny enough, the Ouroboros. If you've studied alchemy, or if you studied Jung's or Neumann's analysis of this symbol, you'll be familiar with it. But he had a dream of this symbol, of this snake biting its own tail, and from that, he was able to figure out how the benzene ring is actually structured. Again, that's not the conscious mind doing that. That was a dream image. He saw that in a dream, so it was his unconscious mind which actually helped him. Another example was the periodic table. The periodic table wasn't something, what's his name? Mendeleev. It wasn't something that he consciously thought of. It was something that he was kind of sort of working on, and then when he fell asleep, his unconscious mind did the work for him. So again, the unconscious mind is very useful for sort of supplying us with new ideas and sort of allowing us to think outside the box. And it's this thinking outside the box which sort of allows for the big sort of developments in science. Because in order to be sort of successful in science, you need to be willing to accept that your prior assumptions, the things which you were previously taught, were wrong. In this case, for Einstein, it would be how gravity used to work. They used to think that it was a force like other forces, but it turns out it's not. And you have to be willing to accept the possibility that the previous model was wrong in order to sort of gain a new, more accurate model. And in fact, one of the reasons we seem to dream, according to many scientists, is exactly this. It's exactly so that the brain kind of experiments with new information and sort of tries to find new insights for the conscious mind to integrate and to be able to utilize in waking life. Now, as you can see, the transcendent function is something which occurs naturally. You don't need to force it to happen, it'll just happen. Even though it sounds very mystical and very, like metaphysical with a transcendent function, it's really quite simple, and it's really something you've definitely experienced, and it's something that which everybody experiences and which you will continue to experience throughout your life. However, it is kind of because it's out of our direct control, it can be sometimes hard to make use of this. For instance, I've had a huge number of dreams where I believe like I saw something really interesting, like a new idea, but I didn't take the time to actually write it down, so I never was able to use them. And another problem with dreams is that because they're so chaotic and random, it's very hard to sort of analyze them and see what they're actually trying to say. And so that's led to the possibility that we could deliberately induce states of mind in which we experience our unconscious more directly. That way we can sort of take more control of this transcendent function. And in fact, this is actually the premise of shamanism. Shamanism is an attempt to sort of induce these states of mind in which you experience your own conscious, in which you're enabled access to your unconscious mind in order to find out what it's trying to say to you. And there are various techniques for doing so. The sort of, I guess, most common would be something like fasting, meditation, although meditation may not necessarily do that, but in my experience, it kind of does. Something like rhythmic dancing, staying awake for really long. These kind of experiences allow you to come into contact with your unconscious. But again, the one that I want to focus on, and which has gained a lot of traction in recent years, is the use of psychedelic drugs. The word psychedelic itself means something to the effect of like soul revealing. The idea being that you can use these drugs to explore your unconscious mind, your soul, so to speak. So, however, we do need to be cautious at this point because I don't want to encourage anybody to just go out and do magic mushrooms or LSD because there are dangers involved with these drugs. Legal dangers mainly, because in most countries they are illegal, rather cruelly, I think, in my opinion. Especially since they can be so beneficial. But there are also other dangers, psychological dangers. If you take too much and have a bad experience, there can be kind of problems with this. So it's definitely something you want to be cautious of and sort of familiarize yourself with what you should do if you want to have one of these experiences. But it is well known that psychedelics can really allow you to experience your unconscious mind. There's a lot happens when you take these drugs, the main thing being sort of hallucinations. But again, it's these hallucinations which are very similar to dreams in that they're kind of chaotic, but they also kind of shake up the boundaries of the ego. And there are many associated effects with psychedelic drugs, which kind of confirm this in my mind. Psychedelics are very closely associated with being open-minded. People are much more open-minded during psychedelic experiences because, again, they're not thinking with the conscious mind; they're kind of thinking with their unconscious mind. And again, psychedelics are also closely associated with creativity. They are known to stimulate creativity. And again, this is the realm of the unconscious. You may have seen a video that I made, or you may have read the original paper about Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perceptions, in which he sort of records his experience with mescaline. And one of the things he notes is that psychedelics kind of, they allow you to take note of the elements of the world around you, which the conscious mind normally filters out. And sort of, the conscious mind, again, needs to be very narrow. It needs to be very focused with regard to its attention. And that causes you to ignore a huge amount of the world around you. But the unconscious mind, especially when you take psychedelics, isn't like this. It kind of notices the details which you otherwise miss. And again, this is sort of more sort of evidence that when you take psychedelics, you're experiencing the unconscious mind to a much greater degree. And now from my own experience, I can definitely say that this connecting principle that I discussed is almost like supercharged when under the influence of psychedelics. It feels like you can see connections and feel connections between seemingly unrelated ideas. And this allows you to think very deeply about the nature of things. It allows you to take a completely new perspective, which is much more deeper and much more nuanced and much more sophisticated than what the conscious mind normally allows. For instance, it's very difficult to comprehend the nature of time and sort of fully grasp the length of time. Like something like the dinosaurs was a mind-bogglingly long time ago, but we don't really perceive it like that. But again, during these states of mind, it feels like you can understand that, and that something like that, you can really start to wrap your mind around the true length of time that was, and really feel the significance of that. Whereas consciously, that's not that significant at all. Now, psychedelics are also useful, not only for changing how you understand the world, but also how you understand yourself. These ideas from your unconscious mind are coming forth, allowing you to integrate them and have a better understanding of yourself. It allows the ego to incorporate more elements of who you actually are, rather than sort of being stuck in your present ego conception. And again, you come into contact with things that you completely forgotten about, of things which have shaped your life, but you haven't exactly remembered. And this allows you to really understand who you are and sort of the elements in your past which have shaped you. This is why psychedelics are closely associated with the phenomenon known as ego death. In fact, ego death is pretty much what we've been talking about this whole time. Now, ego death isn't something I would characterize as a singular phenomenon, but rather encompasses a range of experiences. Whenever it feels like the ego needs to reevaluate some prior assumption which it previously held. And so when you achieve this state of open-mindedness, it allows you to call into question many of the things which you assumed prior to this. And this isn't necessarily a good feeling. It's the ego doesn't want to be shaken up; it wants to be stable. And so when you feel the ego dissolving, it can be kind of scary, because the ego naturally wants to resist that death. But again, if a lot can be on the line if you don't allow this to happen, because you aren't able to evolve as a person and sort of gain new information and gain a new perspective. So it is something that, even though it's your mind naturally resists it, can be very valuable. So my opinion on this is that psychedelics are a consistent way to sort of experience the transcendent function and reap all the benefits of it. And they can be used to mediate creativity and even, to treat certain psychological disorders. There's actually a huge body of evidence which suggests that psychedelics can be used in the treatment of depression, and even things like addiction. So of course there must be something happening here at the psychological level, and it probably has to do with the transcendent function, with the ability to take a deeper perspective, which is sort of allows you to change your behavior and note your sort of toxic behavioral patterns, which you're otherwise unconscious of. Which is why, in my view, I'm definitely on board with the sort of psychedelic renaissance which is occurring right now. But again, I must stress caution, because this isn't a joke, right? These are very serious things, and you shouldn't go into them, willy nilly. These are very serious. There can be consequences. Unfortunately, there can be legal consequences. So it's not something that I can necessarily recommend. But speaking from my perspective, this experience does allow you to explore the unconscious mind, and there are many benefits to doing so. Anyways, that's my whole spiel on that. That's sort of all the things I wanted to talk about. Hopefully, this complements that previous video well, and you can kind of get a better sense of what I was trying to say in that video. But anyways, if you watched so far, thanks for watching. I really appreciate those of you who watch these longer videos. They're actually much easier for me to make than the other ones, which are scripted. But I don't mind doing the scripted one as well. But anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next video. Take care.